It's weird how some moments in your life hit you with this sudden jolt, and before you even realize what's happening, everything flips upside down. For me, that moment was last Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of a crowded cafe, where I was supposed to meet a friend. Except, instead of meeting her, I ended up face down on the floor, completely out of it, saved by a total stranger I barely noticed in the first place. So, there I was, standing in line at that little corner coffee shop I usually avoid because it's always packed. I was running late, trying to juggle my phone and my backpack, when the world started spinning faster than it should. One second, I was scrolling through a message from my boss. The next, I felt like someone hit the reset button on my body's balance. My vision blurred, heart pounding in a way that didn't feel right, and then, nothing. Blackout. I don't actually remember hitting the floor, but I woke up to a pair of hands gently holding my shoulders, steadying me. The voice that pulled me back from the edge was calm, surprisingly soothing in that chaotic cafe noise. Hey, easy. You okay? I blinked a few times, trying to focus, and that's when I saw him. Dark hair slightly tousled like he'd been in a hurry, eyes a clear shade of blue that looked almost too bright for such a gray day. He had this kind of quiet confidence, not the loud, showy type, but the sort that makes you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you're on the verge of passing out on the floor of a cafe. I mumbled something about feeling dizzy, and he immediately crouched down beside me, scanning my face like I was some puzzle he was trying to solve. I could tell he was worried, but trying not to make a scene. Do you have anyone I can call? Or maybe water? You look like you need to sit down for a bit, he said, his voice low, almost protective. Honestly, I felt embarrassed more than anything else. I'm usually pretty good at handling myself, not the type to faint in public, but that day my body just gave out. And instead of running away or ignoring me like most strangers probably would, this guy stuck around, watching out for me like it was the most natural thing in the world. It didn't take long for my friend to show up, and as she rushed over with worried eyes, I realized I didn't even know this guy's name. He was already helping me sit up, making sure I was steady. Thanks, I said, still catching my breath. He smiled, a little shy, and said, no problem. Just glad you're okay. What struck me most wasn't just his kindness. It was how in that fleeting moment, surrounded by 100 distractions, he became the only thing that felt real. That stranger who saved me from falling wasn't just some random guy passing by. Somehow, I felt like meeting him was exactly what I needed, even if I had no idea why yet. And that's how it all started. Me, a fainting mess, and this guy who showed up out of nowhere and stayed long enough to make me wonder if maybe some strangers aren't strangers at all. After my friend arrived and started fussing over me like I was some fragile glass sculpture, I found myself glancing back at him, the stranger who'd helped me up, steady and calm like he'd done this 100 times before. He was still there, leaning against the counter with this easygoing posture, watching us with that same quiet intensity. Hey, I said, a little louder this time, because I figured, why not? What's your name? He looked surprised, like maybe he hadn't expected me to speak to him beyond a quick thanks. Then he smiled, this warm, genuine smile that made my chest tighten for a second. I'm Luke. Luke. I repeated it in my mind, feeling like it suited him somehow. Simple, straightforward, easy to remember. I told my friend I was okay. Well, as okay as I could be after almost passing out. And she gave me that look that said, "Are you sure you don't need a doctor?" I waved her off, mostly because I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But honestly, part of me was still shaken up. Not just from fainting, but because of how calming Luke's presence was. Like a steady anchor in a sea of chaos. Luke stayed by my side for a few more minutes, sipping his own coffee, clearly not in a rush to disappear. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or if I was just being polite, but something felt different. So, do you come here often? I asked, immediately cringing at how cheesy that line sounded in my head. He laughed, and it was one of those laughs that made the space between us feel less awkward, more than I probably should. It's the only place around here that serves a decent espresso, I smiled. Same, though today, I should have stayed home instead of risking a near heart attack over a latte. He tilted his head like he was considering my words, and then said, "Sounds like you might need to slow down a bit." Yeah, I admitted. Life's been kinda hectic lately. Work's been crazy, and I guess my body decided to remind me I'm not invincible. Luke nodded, like he understood more than I was saying. Tough weeks are the worst. We talked for a bit longer. Small talk at first, but it felt natural, like we'd known each other longer than just those few minutes. He had this laid-back vibe, but when he talked about his job as a graphic designer, I could tell he was passionate, even if he didn't gush about it. At some point, my friend excused herself to take a call, leaving us alone by the counter. That's when Luke looked at me with this curious expression, like he was deciding whether or not to ask something important. "You okay with me hanging out for a bit?" he asked. "Yeah," I said without hesitation. "I mean, I don't even know you, but I'm not ready to be alone after that." He smiled again, and for some reason, I felt a little hopeful. We found a small corner table, the kind tucked away from the main hustle, and settled in. The cafe noise faded into the background as we talked about everything and nothing: music, movies, favorite spots in the city. I was surprised at how easy it was to open up to a guy I'd just met in, of all places, a moment of personal crisis. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "So, what made you faint? You mentioned work stress, but was there something else?" I hesitated. Normally, I'm not one to share too much about my health or how I've been feeling low lately. But Luke's eyes were patient, not pushy, and I found myself telling him about the headaches I'd been ignoring, how the stress was creeping in deeper than I wanted to admit. He listened carefully, then said, "You should probably see a doctor. Sometimes ignoring these things only makes them worse." "I know," I said, feeling a bit exposed, but also grateful that he cared without sounding judgmental. There was a pause, and then he said, "I'm glad I was here when you needed help." I looked at him, a little surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Me too." After that, we fell into a comfortable silence. It wasn't awkward. It felt like a brief pause in a conversation that wasn't quite over. Before I knew it, the cafe was starting to empty out for the evening. My friend came back, giving me a thumbs up that I was actually okay, and I realized it was time to get going. Luke stood up with me, and as we walked toward the door, I felt this strange reluctance, like I wanted to keep this moment going, to not let the day end right there. "Do you want to get dinner sometime?" I blurted out, surprising myself. He looked at me like I'd just thrown a curveball, but then his smile grew wider. "Yeah, I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, and just like that, what started as a fainting mishap turned into something unexpected. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a while, I felt like maybe I didn't have to face everything alone. As I walked home that evening, phone buzzing softly in my pocket with a text from Luke, I couldn't help but think. Sometimes, when you're at your lowest, the right stranger shows up and changes everything. I just never expected that stranger to become someone I wanted to know more than anyone else. The next few days were a blur of normal routines, but every so often my phone would buzz with a message from Luke, and suddenly the day felt a little less gray. He wasn't overly clingy or insistent, just this easy presence that didn't demand much but gave me a surprising amount of comfort. Our first dinner was at this small, cozy Italian place he recommended. It was the kind of spot with dim lighting and brick walls, the kind that feels like a secret tucked into the city. When I arrived, Luke was already there, casually waiting at a corner table, looking exactly as I remembered. Calm, a little nervous maybe, but mostly just real. "Hey," he said with that same warm smile, standing up to pull out a chair for me. "Hey," I replied, feeling my heart do this weird little flip that I wasn't expecting. We talked over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, sharing stories about our lives, hopes, and the little things that make us who we are. He told me about growing up in a small town, moving here for work, the struggle of carving out a space for himself in a bustling city. I shared my own stories about trying to keep my head above water in a job that rarely stopped demanding more, about feeling like I'd been running on empty for too long. What surprised me most was how easy it was to be honest with him. No judgment, no awkward silences, just this natural flow that made me forget all the usual walls I put up. At some point, he reached across the table and brushed a stray strand of hair off my forehead. A simple gesture, but it sent this strange warmth through me, like a quiet, "I'm here," that didn't need words. After dinner, we ended up walking through the city streets, the night air crisp but not cold. The city lights cast a glow that made everything feel softer, like a scene from a movie, but real. We talked about silly things, favorite movies, terrible dating stories, but also deeper stuff, like what we wanted out of life and love. At one point, Luke stopped and looked at me with those clear blue eyes. "I'm really glad you fainted that day," he said, and I laughed, surprised. "You're a strange guy," I teased. "Most people would freak out if a stranger just collapsed in front of them." He shrugged, grinning. "I guess I'm not most people." That night, walking home, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just the relief of finding someone who cared, but this new, tentative hope that maybe things could be different, that maybe I didn't have to keep pushing myself to the edge just to feel alive. Over the next couple of weeks, Luke and I kept seeing each other whenever we could. Sometimes it was just coffee, sometimes longer dinners, and sometimes walks that stretched into late-night conversations about everything and nothing. Each time, I felt like I was peeling back layers of myself I hadn't shown anyone in a long time, and he did the same. One Saturday, we decided to check out this little art exhibit he'd mentioned. I wasn't super into art, but he was so passionate about it that I couldn't say no. Walking through the gallery, watching him animatedly describe each piece, I realized how alive he made me feel, not just safe or calm, but genuinely excited. At one point, he stopped in front of a painting that was just splashes of color, abstract and chaotic. "See," he said, "sometimes art doesn't make sense at first, but if you look closely, there's something beautiful in the chaos." I thought about that and looked at him instead. Maybe that's what this whole thing is. Life, I mean. Beautiful chaos. He smiled, eyes shining, with something I couldn't quite place. Exactly. That night, after saying goodbye, I lay in bed thinking about how strange and unexpected all this was. How a fainting spell and a stranger's kindness had turned into something I wasn't ready to name yet, but already felt important. But, of course, life isn't all smooth sailing. Just as things started to feel real, I noticed Luke pulling away a little. Texts came less often. Our conversations grew shorter. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd just say, "Yeah, just busy," but I could hear the distance in his voice. One evening, after a quiet dinner where the words felt heavy and forced, he finally admitted, "I'm sorry. I've been dealing with some stuff. Family things." I nodded, trying not to look too worried. "Want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but I promise I'm not going anywhere." Even with that promise, the gap between us lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I wanted to be patient, to give him space, but part of me was terrified of losing whatever we'd started. Then came the night when I got a call from him, voice rough and urgent. "Can you come over? I need someone." That was the moment I realized Luke wasn't just a stranger who helped me after I fainted. He was the person I wanted to be there for, the one I didn't want to lose, no matter how messy or complicated things got. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, heart pounding with a mix of worry and something new, hope. Because sometimes, the people who come into your life when you're falling apart are the ones who help you put yourself back together. And maybe, just maybe, they become the ones you can't imagine living without. I didn't hesitate. As soon as I heard Luke's voice on the phone, breathy, strained, barely holding it together, I threw on my jacket and left my apartment in a rush. The city was unusually quiet that night, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting through the darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it was. This guy that first barely knew, the stranger who helped me when I fainted, was now calling me to be there in his darkest hour. I got to his place, a small, cramped apartment on the third floor of an old brick building, within 15 minutes. My heart was pounding, the knot in my stomach tightening with every step up the rickety stairs. When I knocked, Luke opened the door almost immediately, his face pale and eyes red-rimmed. He looked exhausted, like he'd been fighting something for days. "Hey," I said softly, stepping inside. He didn't respond right away, just closed the door behind me and leaned against it, folding his arms across his chest. For a second, the silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then suddenly he exhaled sharply and said, "I didn't want to bother you with this. It's just family stuff. My dad's sick, and it's worse than we thought." I nodded, not sure what to say. I hadn't met his family, didn't know what kind of relationship he had with his dad. but I could tell this was serious. The way his voice cracked told me everything. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked again, a little more gently this time. Luke shook his head. "Not really. I just needed someone to not be alone tonight." I understood that feeling all too well, wanting company not because you had answers, but just because the silence felt too loud when you were hurting. We ended up sitting on his couch, not saying much at first. I handed him a glass of water, and he took it gratefully, his hands trembling slightly. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a comforting kind of mess that felt lived in. After a while, he looked over at me and managed a small, tired smile. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," I replied. "You don't have to go through this alone." He nodded, but the weight in his eyes didn't lift. We sat there for a long time, the kind of silence that still feels like connection. I didn't push him to talk, but I didn't leave either. Eventually, Luke rested his head back against the couch, closing his eyes. "It's just hard. I keep thinking about what might happen, and it's like this constant ache in my chest." I reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing my hand over his. It was a small gesture, but to me it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His fingers twitched slightly, but didn't pull away. "I'm here," I said softly. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and for a second, the vulnerability in his gaze took my breath away. "I don't usually let people see this side of me," he admitted. "Well, you're stuck with it now." I teased lightly. "I'm not going anywhere." He laughed softly, a real, genuine laugh that felt like a crack of light in a room I hadn't realized was so dark. That night marked a turning point. Over the next few days, I found myself spending more time at his place. Sometimes just sitting quietly, sometimes helping with small things he didn't have the energy for. We cooked dinner together a couple of times, and though neither of us were exactly chefs, it was nice, messy, and imperfect, but ours. One afternoon, while making a half-hearted attempt at pasta, Luke suddenly said, "I'm sorry if I've been distant lately. I didn't mean to shut you out." I stopped stirring the sauce and looked at him. "I get it. You're dealing with a lot, but I'm here. You don't have to pretend everything's fine." He smiled, this soft, grateful expression that made my heart ache in the best way. "Thanks for sticking around. It means a lot." We didn't say it out loud, but I think both of us felt the unspoken shift, that what we had was becoming something more than just comfort or convenience. One evening, a week or so later, Luke invited me to a small gathering at his friend's apartment. A casual thing, just a few people, nothing too overwhelming. I was nervous. Social situations weren't exactly my forte, and with everything else going on, I wasn't sure I'd fit in. But Luke took my hand as we walked in, steady and reassuring. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I've got you." And he did. Throughout the night, he stayed close, introducing me to his friends, making sure I was included. Watching him in his element, funny, kind, genuinely loved by the people around him, made me realize how much I wanted to be part of that world. At one point, we stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The city skyline stretched out in front of us, glittering and alive. Luke turned to me, face illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. "I'm glad you're here, more than I can say." I smiled, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. "Me too." He hesitated for a moment, then reached up to brush a stray lock of hair from my forehead again, like he had that first day in the cafe. It was intimate, tender, and I felt myself leaning into it. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, voice low and hopeful. I didn't have to think twice. Yeah, our lips met under the open night sky, and everything else, the stress, the fear, the uncertainty, faded away. In that moment, it was just us, two people finding something real in the middle of all the chaos. Afterward, we stayed close, wrapped up in each other's arms, the city humming softly beneath us. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I had found something worth holding on to. Of course, life didn't suddenly become perfect. Luke's dad's health was still a constant worry, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to pull us under. But through those hard moments, we leaned on each other, finding strength in what we were building together. I never expected to meet someone who would change my life the way Luke did, someone who showed up when I was at my lowest and stayed through the storms. Sometimes, it takes a moment of vulnerability, a fainting spell on a busy day, to open the door to something you didn't even know you were ready for. And when that door opens, all you can do is step through and see where it leads. After that night on the balcony, something between Luke and me shifted in a way I hadn't fully expected. It wasn't just that we'd kissed or that we were officially together now. It was more subtle than that. Like the quiet understanding that came with knowing someone had your back no matter what the calendar said or how messy life got. Still, life didn't exactly slow down. Luke's dad's illness weighed heavily on him, and I could see the strain in his eyes more clearly every day. But instead of pulling away, he let me in more. We started sharing the small details of our days, the random thoughts that popped up, and the worries that kept us up at night. One evening, after a long day at work that left me feeling drained, I found myself at Luke's place again. He was sitting on the couch, a cup of tea in hand, scrolling through his phone. When I walked in, he looked up and smiled, that familiar warmth flooding through me. "Hey, you," he said, patting the spot next to him. I sank down beside him, and for a moment we just sat there, comfortable in the silence. "You okay?" I asked, noticing the tightness in his jaw. He sighed. "My dad's in the hospital again. They're running tests. I don't know what to expect." My heart ached for him. "Want me to come with you tomorrow?" He glanced at me, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Would you?" "Of course. You don't have to face this alone." Luke nodded, leaning into me just a little. "Thanks. That means more than I can say." The next day, we spent hours at the hospital, waiting, pacing, trying to distract ourselves from the weight of uncertainty. Luke was quiet, but every so often he'd reach for my hand, grounding himself. I wasn't sure what the doctors were saying exactly. Medical jargon always went over my head, but I could tell things were serious. After the appointment, we grabbed coffee at a nearby cafe, the world outside moving on, but us stuck in this bubble of worry. "I hate feeling so powerless," Luke admitted, staring into his cup. "I get it," I said. "But you're not alone. We'll get through this together." He looked up, eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I could see the vulnerability he usually hid behind his calm exterior. "I'm scared." "Me too," I whispered. "But fear doesn't have to control us." That day marked a new kind of closeness between us, one built not just on laughter and easy conversation, but on shared fears and the messy, painful parts of life. It wasn't always pretty, but it was real. In the weeks that followed, Luke's dad's condition fluctuated. There were good days and bad days, and through it all, Luke leaned on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself stepping up, not just as his boyfriend, but as his confidant, his support, the person who reminded him he wasn't alone. One night, after a particularly rough day, we were sitting on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by takeout containers and empty wine glasses. Luke was curled up against me, and I played with the curls at the nape of his neck, trying to soothe the tension I could feel radiating from him. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he whispered. "You're stronger than you think," I said. "And I'm here. We'll figure it out, one day at a time." He looked up at me then, eyes glistening. "I don't say it enough, but thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled, leaning in to kiss his forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." It was moments like that when I realized how much Luke had become a part of my world. The guy who helped me up after I fainted was now the person I wanted to see first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were arguments, small ones that spiraled because of stress and exhaustion. Times when I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to balance supporting Luke with taking care of myself. One afternoon, after a particularly tense conversation about whether he should move back home to help his family, we sat across from each other, frustration simmering between us. "I just want to do what's best for everyone," Luke said, voice tight. "I know," I replied, "but don't forget to think about what's best for you too." He sighed, rubbing his face. "I'm scared of making the wrong choice. Whatever you decide, I'll be here, no matter what." He reached across the table, gripping my hand. "Thank you for being my rock." As the months passed, we found a rhythm, imperfect but ours. We celebrated small victories, a good hospital report, a quiet weekend together, a new recipe that didn't burn. We held each other through the hard times and laughed through the ridiculous ones. One evening, as we lay tangled in his bed, Luke looked over at me and said, "You know, I never expected to meet someone like you that day." Me neither, I admitted. I thought you were just some guy who happened to catch me when I fell. He smiled, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. Turns out, I was the guy you needed all along. I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the summer night outside. Yeah, looks like fate has a weird sense of humor. We laughed, the sound filling the room, and I knew that no matter what the future held, we'd face it together. Because sometimes, the most unexpected meetings lead to the most meaningful connections. And sometimes, when you're brought back from the edge, the person who catches you becomes the one you never want to let go. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything finally felt like it was settling into place. Not because all the problems were gone, but because we'd found a way to carry them together. Luke and I were sitting on the small balcony of his apartment, the city humming softly below us. He had his sketchbook out, absent-mindedly doodling while I sipped on a cup of tea, the sun warm on my face. We didn't need to fill the silence. It was comfortable, the kind of silence that comes from knowing someone deeply without needing constant words. After a while, Luke closed his sketchbook and looked up at me, a softness in his eyes that made my chest tighten. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about how much has changed since that day in the cafe. Funny how life throws you into these unexpected moments." I smiled. "Yeah, I never imagined fainting would lead to all this." He chuckled, then reached out, taking my hand in his. "You've been my anchor through everything, the chaos, the fear. I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful. For you." I squeezed his hand gently. "I feel the same. You showed me what it means to be seen, to be cared for when I thought I was invisible." Luke's smile deepened, and for a moment, the world felt still. Not perfect, but enough. Real. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I want to face it with you." "Me too," I replied, heartful. We leaned into each other, the city stretching out around us, messy and unpredictable, but ours to navigate together. In that quiet moment, I realized that sometimes life's unexpected turns lead you exactly where you're meant to be. And sometimes, the stranger who catches you when you fall becomes the person who helps you rise.